Hi, I'm Diana Marquis, host of About Fundraising the podcast. I'm also the founder and chief strategist for DM Group Consulting, a boutique consultancy that works with nonprofit organizations on their board education and training and fundraising planning. I'll also provide coaching for executive directors and development directors. You can find me on LinkedIn and at my website, dmgroupconsulting.com. Today, my guest is Michelle Monse. She is the principal and founder of M2 Foundation Services, LLC. She is also an attorney. Many of us know her as the president of the Carl B. and Florence E. King Foundation, where she led that foundation for 20 years. When I heard she retired in January of this year and opened her own consulting practice, I wasn't surprised. What did catch my attention was her focus on nonprofits that serve rural areas of the Southwest. Michelle, thank you for joining me today on About Fundraising the podcast.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
You had an impressive career even before you took on the King Foundation. You administered a corporate foundation, directed a college capital campaign for an historically black college, taught at 3 law schools, and worked in the civil litigation and real estate sections of a Dallas law firm. What drew you to work for the King Foundation?
Well, as you may recall, at that point in time, the King Foundation and the Attorney General of Texas were suing the former executives and board members of the King Foundation. And that did not scare me off because of my legal background. I had to wait a while before the litigation progressed to a point where they could actually interview me. So it was about another 18 months after I learned of the vacancy before I actually interviewed. But I thought my background, especially having worked at a community foundation managing their scholarship programs, which King also had at the time, working as a grant officer. I'd also been the administrator of the BLO Foundation, which was a corporate foundation. I thought my background was really well aligned with what the King Foundation needed, which was somebody who already knew how to run a foundation, given the trouble they'd been in and were still involved in at the time. They really couldn't afford someone who was going to learn on the job, and that was not me. And so happily, the board agreed that my background was the best match for the role.
So were you just looking for a new challenge or what? I mean, there was a lot going on with that would have scared off a lot of people, I would think.
Yes, it probably would have scared off a lot of people. But again, my being a lawyer, that aspect of it didn't frighten me, that the litigation was still going on and went on for several years after I got there. But I really liked the challenge of rebuilding the foundation and rebuilding its reputation because I thought it could do a lot more for the community than it had in the last few years under the prior administration. So it was really exciting to step in. I kind of joke around that it was a 40-year-old startup when I got there. But rebuilding everything, putting in systems, guidelines, grant policies, all of that was really fun for me at the time.
Well, we're glad you did it. Speaking as one of the recipients of funding from different organizations I worked for, we were glad that you stepped into that role. Your undergraduate degree is from Texas Tech in Lubbock. How does that experience play into your desire now to work with nonprofits in the rural Southwest?
Well, Texas Tech was the first time that I was exposed to a lot of young people who'd grown up in rural areas. Of course, there were folks from Houston, like I was, and Dallas and some bigger cities. But by and large, the population was young people who'd grown up in the Panhandle. And they were some of the finest people I ever met up to that point in my life, and actually still. They would measure up that way. They're hardworking and forthright, honest, and it just gave me a heart for West Texas and the Panhandle, High Plains. And my work with the King Foundation enabled me to continue with that interest in the grant making that we did in the region.
Other than geography, what are some of the differences between urban and rural nonprofits?
Well, I sometimes say that nonprofits live in the underworld. They are understaffed, under-resourced, underappreciated, and that is nowhere more true than for rural nonprofits. Public resources are meager or out of reach for rural nonprofits, sometimes by design, by government entities. Rural nonprofits can also be hamstrung by community power structures, if I can call them that, as well as relationships. And I'll give you an example. I was visiting a rural museum which had some fascinating pieces, and they could have told a really good and interesting story. But they had a lot of, frankly, junk in the museum as well. And I asked the manager of the museum, I said, well, don't you have a policy about what you'll accept? And she said, well, no. She said, people in the community were accustomed to giving whatever was left over after Grandma's estate closed to the museum. And she was afraid that if they stopped that practice, it would create a lot of bad relationships in the community. That is not a situation a museum in a big city would be engaged in. Another example, county judges in Texas have a lot of power. And if the county judge is not on your side for a project, then you're in big trouble. I ran into that a couple of times with some nonprofits, not being able to do what they wanted to do because of the powers that be in that county weren't on board with it.
You're right. Those are some pretty significant differences just right there. I grew up in West Texas in a small town, Big Spring, halfway between Dallas and El Paso. I say that and people I can see them trying to see the geography. So anyway, I'm very familiar with the lifestyles of people living in West Texas. What are the foundations doing to better address the needs of communities in West Texas and New Mexico?
Fortunately, I think there's a lot of increased awareness of the needs in rural communities. Some of the things that I've seen recently are the Community Foundation of Abilene has a fund called the Wyndham Fund that was set up by a woman who grew up in a small town south of Abilene called Oplin, Texas. And she set up a fund before she died that benefits nonprofits within a 150-mile radius of Oplin. That's about 20 counties, I think. So now the Community Foundation has a lot of resources to devote specifically to rural areas. And really, if you look at 150 miles from Oplin, it's a pretty big section of Central Texas. So they've got resources that they didn't have before. And one of the things they did with Wyndham Fund money is they had a rural philanthropy conference in Sweetwater, Texas in early August. I was fortunate enough to be a speaker there. And they had, I think, about 100 nonprofits from the region who came and got some training, also got to meet with some funders who would consider proposals from the area. Another example, I think 6 years ago in Midland, Odessa, the Permian Strategic Partnership was created. It's now got 28 members who are mostly energy companies, but 2 university systems. And they've directly contributed $184 million into the West Texas community and southeastern New Mexico, which is geologically part of the Permian Basin, as you know, in the areas of education and workforce development, healthcare, and road safety, which is a direct result of the very heavy use that the energy industry makes of local roads.
You posted a speech by Representative Drew Darby from San Angelo, where he spoke about the challenges of rural communities. What moved you about what he had to say?
Well, I was struck by the flat-out unfairness of the situation we have now where rural areas are treated as sort of extraction colonies. They provide a lot of resources for the rest of the state, but they come in last when it comes to public resources, and that's just not fair. There's a combination of hubris, I think, in urban areas, as well as just a lack of awareness of how much rural areas in Texas provide to the welfare of the entire state. Take energy, for example. Last year, Texas produced 43% of America's oil and 27% of its natural gas. It's the top producing state in the nation, and it's one of the largest in the world. Texas is also the national leader in wind power. And we can all testify to the fact that those oil wells and those windmills are not sitting in the middle of big urban areas. They're in rural Texas. So we have to recognize, in all fairness, to say, as Representative Darby did, that the state needs to leave rural areas with enough resources that they can continue to live there and have education and health care and safe transportation, all the things that people in urban areas have come to expect as a matter of course.
I read through his speech, and I don't remember the statistics. I should have written those down. But the square miles and the number of people there and the representation they have compared to like Houston or Dallas. Right. I think like he's one and he covers hundreds of miles of a district.
Right. The districts are very large. And I think Representative Darby mentioned in his speech that in the Texas State House, 2/3 of the state, which is rural, has 17 representatives in the state, and the city of Houston alone has 25. So if you go west of I-35, the I-35 corridor, that's about 2/3 of the land mass of Texas and maybe 20% of the population.
I don't know how that could be made equitable since representation is based on population. But I really, really appreciate the points he was making. And I hope that raised some attention among his colleagues that there's something that needs to be done. I hope they're smart enough to figure that out.
Well, even representatives from urban or suburban areas can still vote in ways that support rural Texas. They just have to be aware of the need and be able to both see and articulate how supporting rural Texas supports the communities that they represent.
To be continued. I will keep an eye on Representative Darby for sure. So I want to switch a little bit to talk about the overall state of grant funding. What are private and family foundations doing to address the elimination of government funding? It might be too early to respond to that, but surely within your community, your network, you've heard some discussion about that.
Well, the response of foundations depends a great deal on the asset size of the foundation and their mission. And for those foundations that have the flexibility with their income and missions to take some action, some have increased their payout rate from the 5% that's typical to 6 or 7%, at least on a short-term basis. And others have created some emergency funds for nonprofits to keep the doors open. But there's really not good data yet. As you pointed out, it's pretty early. The nonprofit information center called Candid that you're familiar with did a survey in early 2025. And the foundations showed that 38% of the foundations expected to increase their giving in 2025. But it's hard to know whether that increase is because of their response to what's happening with government funding. I rather doubt that it was, just given the date of the survey, or whether they are just going to give away more because their assets have grown, because the stock market, despite a lot of volatility, has been on an upward trajectory. So we'll just have to wait and see. Giving USA study that came out in June showed that foundations, both of private independent foundations and private family foundations, gave $110 billion to charity in 2024. That's only up about 2.4% from 2023. So it's basically keeping up with inflation in the last couple years, but we'll just have to see whether there's a big influx of funding in 2025 in response to the cuts. But whether foundations can keep that up is one question, but no question that's not answered yet. But whether we can do away with federal funding and at the level that's occurred so far, foundations or even all public philanthropy will not be able to replace that. Giving USA also showed that there was almost $600 billion with a B given to charity in 2024. The budget reconciliation bill that was passed in July will spend $3.4 trillion over the next 10 years. And that spending is not even per year, but if you just do quick calculations and say, okay, let's assume $340 million a year, American public and foundations would not be able to keep up that level of spending to replace all that very long. And then they would not be able to give to the many other things that do not receive government funding, of course.
This seems like a much scarier time than even when the pandemic threw everything up in the air.
Yeah, I agree. It is a much tougher time for nonprofits. I've lived through both, obviously. And at least in the pandemic, everybody was in the same boat. Every nonprofit was struggling. Businesses were struggling. There was a lot of shared pain. And in this situation, there are obviously some nonprofits that are more reliant on government funding than others. And so it's a lot of anxiety out there in the nonprofit community, but the intensity of it varies, I think, by the type of nonprofit.
I would agree with that. You have said that your entire working life has involved writing or editing in some form. What is your advice to nonprofits who submit grants to family foundations?
I would treat a family foundation much like I would treat an individual donor, because the decision makers in those situations will be motivated by similar factors in deciding on a grant as they would if they were going to give personally. First of all, I would do some research to determine how many staff the foundation has. There's a place on the tax return where you can indicate the number of staff members. If a foundation has few or no staff, then the person who's reading your application has a day job, most likely. And so I would suggest that nonprofits do everything you can to minimize the workload and the effort that the person reading the proposal has to put in, and give them the tools to quickly understand your agency and its work. Now, that sounds obvious, but I mean things like give them a fact sheet on your agency that includes when you were founded, the number of board members you have, your service statistics, the kind of facts that someone would want to have in writing up a summary of your agency for other decision makers. Minimize jargon. Oh my gosh. Nonprofits are almost worse about jargon than the legal profession that I left. But you really have to cut that out and speak like and write like a normal person. Tell an illustrative story that shows the impact of your agency, and make sure that you've given them everything that they have asked for. It's amazing the number of nonprofits that don't really follow instructions. But if you think about a typical family foundation person, they're maybe have the sole responsibility for evaluating grants. If you can help them get a very concise package together and minimize the amount of effort they have to put in, I think you'll have a better result. And it's not all about just minimizing effort. I want to make clear that it's just that the person reading it, they may not have the opportunity, the time to chase down demographic statistics, for the area you serve or other things that might be important factors in making a decision. So just do that level of work for them.
I'm going to ask this question. It's probably going to be some of the things you've already said. As a grant reviewer, and you've done this for many different funders, what are the 3 top mistakes that many or most nonprofits make?
The first is one I just mentioned, not following instructions.
Right.
That continues to happen. I was always surprised at King when we would get a phone call, someone saying, "Can you tell me how to apply for a grant?" Well, we have an extensive section on our website that explains that generally. So they don't go that extra step of figuring things out and then following the instructions as they're presented. And that's not to say you can't have questions and call, but they don't typically. Second thing, and this is one of the things that bothered me a lot when I was reviewing, is they're not showing past results. Again and again, and a proposal would say, our goal is that, I'm going to make something up, 75% of the students in our adult literacy program increase their reading proficiency by 1 level. So that's their goal. They've been doing this program for a number of years. They never say what they have done in the last year or 2 years. Was it 85%? That'd be a great thing to brag about. And if it's 60%, maybe you want to explain in brief why that's the case. Like maybe the testing method changed, or who knows what the answer might be. But that always drove me crazy. Why don't you tell me what you did last year? And often it was good information, but just telling me what your goal is only part of the story.
Those are all great examples.
Well, and then the last thing I would say that nonprofits need to be mindful of is the narrative that they supply doesn't really focus on the client. They're not really explaining how this grant, if made, would really benefit the clients that they serve. They would talk about it sometimes just in terms of benefits to the agency. I've seen that question answered or presented in really effective ways in proposals. And yeah, I remember one agency years ago that was asking for money for new office furniture. And it was an agency that did counseling. And so the writer was very skilled in explaining about how having furniture that wasn't falling apart would increase employee morale and be able to serve their clients better. Clients coming in would have a better impression of the agency, be more comfortable if there was new furniture, things like that. I'm not giving the proposal justice, but that's an example of how even something you think, well, new furniture, that's only for the agency. Well, no, it can be for the clients too, if you communicate that the right way.
Did they get the money?
They did.
All right.
They did.
I've always heard that no means no for now. Is that true? And then the second part of that is, how can a nonprofit organization know when it's time to stop applying after more than one rejection from a foundation?
Well, the no means not now is true in many cases, but the key is finding out why you were declined. Many funders will now have phone conversations with disappointed applicants to explain the reason for the decline. That was not the case when I started in foundation work in the 1990s, but it's a lot more widespread now. And so if the reason is something, if I can call it this, temporal, like there's just not enough in the foundation's grant budget that year to make the grant, then I would say strengthen your proposal and apply again. If it's something that's temporary, like your agency's in bad financial condition at present, then I'd say improve whatever that situation is, try to fix it, and then apply again. And the only time I would say to an agency that they should not apply again is if there's an incompatible mission or approach. And I'll give you an example of that. At the King Foundation for some time, we were funding homeless shelters. We made a decision internally that if a particular homeless shelter insisted on religious observance before a meal or shelter was provided, then we were not going to fund it. And so there was one homeless shelter here in Dallas that applied to us several times, and they were not going to change their practice of requiring chapel attendance and so forth. We were not going to change our policy. So there was no point in them applying to us. But that's a fairly rare situation. Mm-hmm. Now, I will say some agencies are incredibly persistent, even when they should not be. There was an agency here in Dallas where it was working with young mothers, and they were using a completely unproven program model. And I think they applied 6 or 7 times, even though I told the executive director personally that your program model is not something we're going to fund. But I think she made it a personal challenge that she was going to get us to fund them, and we never did. And the agency eventually merged with a much bigger agency and changed the way it delivered services.
We've only talked about funding from the nonprofit's point of view. What are the challenges that private and family foundations have to deal with these days?
Well, one is the volume of need versus the dollars available. I mean, that's always been the case, but it's, I think, a lot more intense right now. The King Foundation, for example, which I just left 8 months ago, that has 2 grant cycles a year, and they start with a letter of inquiry and then go through a process to be invited to a proposal. For the 2 grant cycles in 2025, King Foundation received 150 LOIs for the spring cycle and 237 for the fall. The normal number of applications for both those cycles is about 100. And so when you think that a program officer can only review about 25 proposals within the time allotted that we have between application and award, it just created such a volume that they couldn't handle. Now, I don't know what the experience of other foundations in the Dallas area has been this year, but I'd be surprised if they were not also seeing an uptick in the number of requests, particularly in light of the change in federal funding.
Wow, that's a huge jump. It is a huge jump.
A couple of other things I would say about challenges from the funder's point of view is I don't think a lot of nonprofits realize that the program officer or whoever it is that's reviewing your application, they can and will act as your advocate internally at the foundation if you let them. So you need to treat them with respect and cooperation and understand that they are not the ultimate decision makers. And so they may advocate for you inside the boardroom, but something else rises to the top for the board and it gets funded. That gets funded, and the request that the program officer was advocating for does not get funded. Has not happened very often in my nonprofit career, on the funder side, but I have had some nonprofits pretty much yell at me on the phone for not getting funded. And trust me, I remember who those folks were. If they came up across my desk again, I would not be favorably disposed toward them.
I worked for a small nonprofit some years ago. One of the board members was, well, let's just go to the Meadows Foundation. I know they'll give us money. We deserve it. And it's like, okay, but this is what they fund. This is their areas of interest. And we're not part of that. Well, I'll just go talk to whoever. And so he and another board member made an appointment with, I forget who they went to talk to. And they did not get funded. Let me just say that up front. But it was like the sense of entitlement just so surprised me. I hope they were the exception to the case. I don't think nonprofits generally feel entitled to get funding.
No, I don't think so.
But there are some out there that do. And it was like, oh my gosh.
Yeah. And the thing to remember too, and this is something that does weigh on people who are on the funding side, is you have to choose among a great number of dozens of community goods. And those are hard choices to make. Nobody really, quote, deserves funding. And the other thing about an agency that has that attitude, you don't know what else is in front of the board or the program officer of the foundation at the time. And so yours may just pale in comparison. You just don't know. And you don't know what goes on in the boardroom and the discussion of grants. But I can probably imagine people listening to this, if they're on the grant seeker side, is, well, boo-hoo that you have too many things to choose from. But, I've been a fundraiser and I've been a funder. And fundraising is harder. I think it is. But being a funder is harder than people think it is. They just think it's like being Santa Claus every day and writing checks and being treated to lunch and, all those things. And it's so much more complex than that.
This has been a very interesting conversation. I like to ask my guests this one last question is, what do you want our listeners to remember from our conversation? Or an alternative question, what did we not mention or talk about that you want to leave with our listeners?
Well, I'll answer the first question, and it has a little bit of the second question in it. And that is that every interaction between a nonprofit and a funder builds the funder's impression of the agency, either for good or for ill. Think about the message that you want to send to a funder. You want them to know that your agency is effective, it's thorough, it's well managed, and all those positive messages. So now think about the message you send when you don't research the foundation, like the person I gave the example of who doesn't even look at the website before they call, doesn't follow instructions. They leave off all the attachments that they're supposed to submit, or they submit or deliver the proposal either right at the deadline or too late. Back in the days when King took paper proposals, our deadline was 4:30 p.m. and if the doorbell rang after 4:30, I opened the door. Now, today, like many other foundations, King Foundation has a grants portal. And I don't know how the system tells the time, but they would set the system that if a proposal was submitted at 4:30 or later, the portal wouldn't take it. And so we would get these panic calls at 4:32 or 4:35, or they'd wait until the last minute to punch that button. Maybe their clock said, it was 4:25. I don't know. Then they had to plead for mercy in order to get their proposal accepted. But that is one of those things that really sends a message that they're waiting till the last minute. I know nonprofit folks are overworked, but if you can submit it at 4:30, you can submit it at 4:20. You don't have to wait till the absolute last second. And so just be conscious of how those actions you take in relation to a funder communicate messages, and you want those messages to be positive about you and your agency.
Yes to all of that. Michelle, thank you for being my guest today on About Fundraising, the podcast.
Sure.
This has been a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. You're very welcome. I'm happy to be here.